Welcome to part 4 of the teaching of Do You See This Woman? And in this study, we're learning what it means for a woman to be seen by Jesus. And this week is titled The Woman Jesus Enlightened. And the question Jesus asked is, do you believe this? Jesus asked this question to a woman named Martha. And Martha's unique to the other women that we've studied so far because Martha's not sick in her physical body and she doesn't have a poor reputation. Martha has strongholds in her mind. Jesus comes to renew her mind. She was considered a virtuous woman. She was a prominent figure in her society, a well-respected high achiever. If she lived today, she would be the president of the school board, or she would be an advocate for her community, or the head of a philanthropy. She was a type A go-getter. And I think we as women can relate to Martha because so much of what drives our emotions and what drives our actions or our insecurities comes from our mind. And Jesus frees up our mind. He frees up wrong mindsets and he enlightens us as we seek him in our lives. So today we're going to look at 2 Bible stories that involve Martha. And as we dive into them, we'll find that he gives her a new perspective. So he enlightens her. What does the word enlightened mean? Enlightened means to be free from ignorance, free from misinformation. It means to shed light on dark places in our mind. And Jesus continually frees her and frees us from wrong mindsets. Martha is known in the Bible for her gift of hospitality. She's sort of a hostess with the mostest. And I kind of want to begin a story, a personal story of one time when I was a host and I had to enlighten my guests on some things that they had, some misinformation. So my parents have a lake house out in the country and we go there often in the summertime. Well, it was a winter break, and so I thought, I'll take some families out there in the winter. So Reese and I invited 3 families, and my friends called me and they said, okay, well, what do we do at the lake in the winter? I mean, obviously we're not getting in the water. And I said, we just play games, and we just eat a lot of good food, and we ride around on mules, and we look for deer out in the woods. And they said, okay, so they packed, and we all got settled in the lake house. And just so you guys know what a mule is, it's kind of like a motorized little golf cart, and it's a brand name for that. So there's like a Polaris or a Ranger. It seats like a family of 6, and you can kind of go off-roading and go in the terrain of the woods. So our friends, we got there, we had dinner, everybody got unpacked, and I said, okay, do you guys want to go ride around on the mules and take the kids? And they were like, okay, So they went in the room and they changed into jeans, 3 of the girls. And I was like, I don't know what they're doing. I mean, I had on leggings and Ugg boots or whatever. And I thought, well, maybe they just brought an outfit. So we're walking out to kind of like a detached garage, and we go out there, and one of my friends says, so where do you keep the mules? And I said, in the garage. And she goes, all year round? And I was like, no. Just like, why does she care? I was like, my parents have 2 of them, they're on the garage. And she said, well, what do you feed them? And then I thought, oh my gosh, she thinks they're animals. And I was like, they're not mules. I'm not going to take you out in the woods and like get on top of a mule and ride around in the woods. I was like, I'm surprised you even came to the lake with us. She was like, well, I just assumed I was just feeling so sad for these little mules out in the garage. I was like, no. So that's kind of a funny story. But in this story, Martha is the host and Jesus is her guest, and Jesus enlightens her. So I'm going to begin by reading the first story we're going to cover, and it's just a short story, but I think we'll see some of ourselves in this story. It's in the book of Luke, chapter 10, verse 38. So as Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. And she came to him and asked, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do all the work myself? Tell her to help me. And Jesus said, Martha, Martha, the Lord answered, you are worried and upset about many things, but only one thing is needed. And Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. So we see that Martha is mentioned 3 different times in the New Testament, and each time she's accompanied by her sister Mary. They're sort of a holy pair in scriptures, but they have opposite personalities. But today we're going to focus on Martha. And Jesus enlightened Martha in 3 areas. If you're taking notes, you may want to write this down. He enlightened her in her culture. He enlightened her in her control. And he enlightened her in her confusion. So he enlightened her in her culture. So I need to give you a little bit of background of the culture. In Luke 10:38, it says a woman named Martha opened her home to him. So she owned this home. She ran this home. And this was very unusual for a woman in the 1st century Judaism to own a home. So we don't really know exactly if she was a widow or if the home was passed down to her by her father. We do know she was a sibling set. So it was Martha, Mary, and they had a younger brother, Lazarus. We can assume he was younger because if the home had been passed down to her, it would have gone to the boy. It would have gone to her son. So Martha was the one who ran the home. So she was a responsible person, and she always would open her home as a hostess. So she lived in a culture that oppressed women, and we need to understand this. This culture saw women as second-class citizens. And Martha had adapted to this mentality. This was her reality. Culture norms of women had changed drastically since Old Testament times. In the Old Testament times, women were included when God implemented the Old Testament in the Mosaic covenant. Women participated in every aspect of community life besides the priesthood. That was reserved for men. Now, male and female were both created in God's image. They were equal. They were unique. They had different roles, but they were equal. Women were not second-class citizens in the Old Testament, or they're not second-class citizens according to God. So in the Old Testament, I'm going to read some scriptures just to prove my point. In Proverbs, these are Old Testament passages. Proverbs 31, women engaged in commerce and real estate. In Psalm 68:25, women played music in the sanctuary. 1 Samuel 1:12, women prayed in the sanctuary with men. Deuteronomy 29:11, women were present when Joshua, who preceded Moses, publicly read the Torah, the law. Women were educated on the law. However, by the time of Jesus, rigorous religious laws implemented by the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes, and the influence of pagan cultures, the influence of the Greek and the Roman culture, had relegated women to a life of seclusion. Their rights had dramatically fallen by the time Jesus came on the scene. They were separated from men in private, public, and religious life. A first-century woman's identity came strictly from her ability to bear children and maintain the home. That was her role. So if you were a widow, or if you were an outcast, or if you were barren, you were hopeless. You had no hope in this culture, no identity. The Jewish rabbis were not permitted to teach women. The rabbis or teachers of Jesus' day declared women to be exempt from learning the law of Moses. Women were often illiterate and uneducated, contributing very little to this patriarchal society that they found themselves a part of. In fact, one of the prayers of Jewish men during Jesus' day was, "Praise be to God that he has not created me to be a woman." So when women would go to the temple, in the Jerusalem temple in Jesus' day, they built a court just for women. They couldn't go beyond the confines of the women's court. There was no such women's court in Solomon's temple. When God gave David instructions to build the temple and King Solomon built it, women participated with men in worship. This was God's design. Jesus adamantly disagreed with the theology of the religious elite of the day. Jesus didn't comply with these social norms. He shattered prejudices, and he showed us that women are not second-class citizens in God's eyes. We see that over and over. Jesus sought out women. He healed women. He included women in his kingdom plans. He enlightened them with his teaching. He dined in their homes. Women were very much equal to men in Jesus' eyes. Jesus doesn't honor man-made boundaries. He accepted women as disciples. So when Martha opens her home to Jesus and Mary's sitting at his feet, a lot of times people say, well, Mary's the laid-back one and Martha's the type A one. And that could have been true. But what Mary was doing was she was positioning herself as a disciple. She was being enlightened by Jesus. She was learning in a culture that wouldn't let her learn, that wouldn't let her be educated. So we need to understand a little bit about this rabbinical style of teaching. Rabbi means master or teacher. And in today's world, a rabbi is the head of a Jewish synagogue, much like a preacher or a priest is the head of a church. But in Jesus' culture, a rabbi was more of a loose title. It was anyone that was a teacher. And in this culture, it was common in the Greek and Jewish community for a prominent rabbi or philosopher to attract students. And the students would follow the rabbi, and they would follow him throughout the day. It wasn't in a traditional classroom, sort of like Jesus' disciples. And that's how they learned. This was the culture. And a rabbi would stand, and the students would sit and learn at his feet. And again, women were not allowed to be educated. They weren't allowed to be disciples. Well, a disciple is a student or a learner. And they would emulate the teacher, and then they would go spread the message. They would try to be like their teacher. This is what a disciple was. Well, when Jesus picked his original disciples, he didn't pick a scribe and a Pharisee or a Sadducee. He didn't pick anyone from the religious elite of the day. The men he chose were not theologically trained. He didn't agree with the religious institutions. He picked fishermen. He picked common men. This is an example of who he was after. He's after people who knew they needed a savior. He didn't go after, he went against this culture in everything he did. And Jesus gave women assignments, and he included them in his disciples. And he gave them a platform for his kingdom. He first appeared to Mary Magdalene in John 20:17-18, when in his resurrected body, the first person he appeared to was a woman. And he said, go tell your brothers. He gave her an assignment. He appeared to the Samaritan woman by the well. She was an outcast. She was excluded from her culture. And Jesus appeared to her, and he gave her the keys to salvation. And he said, go tell your testimony. And it says many Samaritans believed because of her testimony. Women have jobs in the kingdom. God empowers women. And he empowered them in a culture that stifled them. So back to the story. Mary wanted to hear the message. She wanted to be enlightened. She wanted to be included. She wanted to be educated. And Martha said, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do all the work? What Martha's saying is she's not complying with the Jewish laws, the new laws that were implemented. She doesn't know her place. Our place is in the kitchen. Tell her to come in here and help me. And she expected Jesus to say, you better go do that. Women aren't supposed to be enlightened. But Jesus turned her world upside down. He turned culture on its head. He gave her a new perspective. He said, Martha, Martha, you are upset and worried about many things, but only one thing is needed. And Mary has chosen, keyword, chosen what is better. And it will not be taken away from her. He was enlightening her to the ways of his kingdom. In his kingdom, you're not defined by culture. You're defined by Christ. And to be enlightened by him, you need to know what he says about you. And you need to be empowered by him. Then you can go out and do the assignments that he's given you. You're not defined to one assignment. And he's also telling Mary, Mary's chosen what's better. You've got options in my kingdom. You are not confined to one role. Yes, a woman's place in the home is a high calling. Yes, it's a high calling to be a mother. But your first identity is in Christ. Is in Christ. That shouldn't define you, and you're not confined just to that. You have other roles in God's kingdom. God empowers you, and he chooses you. And he wants you to choose him. So Jesus gave Mary and Martha permission to be enlightened, permission to be disciples. He says in Matthew 6:33, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and everything else will be added to you. Seeking Jesus first takes priority. What he thinks of you takes priority over culture. And he always goes against culture. He's not afraid to challenge it. So how are we defined by culture? How does this apply to us? Are we letting culture define how we see beauty? Are we trying to meet the standard of beauty? What does Christ say about it? What does Christ say is beautiful? Are we letting culture define morality? Are we saying, well, this is right and wrong in culture, so it must be right? No. What does Christ say? There's a standard of righteousness. We need to be enlightened so we know. Are we letting culture define our spirituality? Oh, there's a lot of ways to God, and you can just take a little bit. No, Jesus says there's one way to God, and it's through me. You need to be defined. You need to be enlightened by Jesus so you can go out in culture and know who you are and know who Jesus says you are. So the first point, if you're taking notes, Jesus enlightened Martha to be defined by him, and not her culture. So number 2 is control. And I'm going to use the same story, but I'm going to pull out some different points I think we as women can relate to. Martha was gifted in hospitality. And Jesus traveled in his earthly ministry for 3 years. It never talks about him going back to his home of origin, but it often talks about him taking refuge in the home of Mary and Martha. Jesus loved this little family. He loved going there. She used her gifts, and he appreciated her gifts. With her type A personality, she probably always had clean towels and a stocked pantry and clean sheets. She was organized and ran her home well, and Jesus appreciated this. But with her personality, she could have had little patience for unproductivity, or people not meeting her high standards and getting the job done. And Jesus understood this. And Jesus, remember, he sees our hearts. He sees our hearts. We can be doing good things, but he sees the motive behind it. So again, we're going to visit the same story. She says, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do all the work? Tell her to come help me. So she's telling on her sister to Jesus. And he says, Martha, Martha, you are worried and upset. So these are the key words here. You are worried and upset about many things. And Mary has chosen what's better. He's pointing out her gift of serving wasn't the problem. Her motives were the problem. She was operating out of a wound. She was worried and upset. How many times do we as women, when we get worried, or we get upset, or we get afraid, we start trying to control everybody? We start getting control issues. You come in the kitchen and help me, Jesus. You tell her to do that. We start manipulating. We start manipulating things. And I know often as women, this is an issue. This is an issue for me. We get tunnel vision. We want everyone to do what we want to do so we can meet our schedule. And sometimes we miss the big picture. I mean, Jesus, the Son of God's in her living room. But she's trying to control everyone and get dinner on time. She's worried and upset that it's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be on her standard. And Jesus is saying, Martha, Martha, you're missing it. Your tunnel vision is missing the big picture, and you're hyper-controlling. You're operating out of a wound, not out of the overflow of peace. That your motive isn't pure. And I know that God had to totally correct me in this area. About 6 years ago, God was dealing with my issues of control. So I had 4 babies at this point. They were little, and I didn't have help every day. I eventually got it, but I didn't have it at this time. And so I was just so overwhelmed, and I would put all this pressure on myself to get this long to-do list done. And it was like the one thing I could control was to get all my errands done. So my sitter would walk in the door, or my mom, or my mother-in-law, and out I would go. And I would have like an hour to myself, and I would speed all over town. Like, I would float stop signs. I was like a safety hazard. I really was. I would put all this pressure to try to get all this stuff done and just control and do all this stuff. And at my all-time low, I literally got a ticket on the way to Target and on the way home by the same policeman. He was like, what is wrong with you? I was like, I have 4 kids, I just have this long list. I'm just trying to get all this stuff. And I feel like the Lord is telling me, Lainey, you are so worried and upset, and only one thing is needed. You've lost perspective. You have tunnel vision. You're just trying to get all this stuff done, and you're breaking the law. So he taught me this lesson I got a letter in the mail, and I didn't even know this was a thing, but like I paid all my speeding tickets, so I just didn't really pay much attention, you know. Well, I got a letter saying that you're going to suspend my license for 3 months. I was like, oh my goodness. I mean, I called every lawyer I knew. I could not get out of it. I guess it was like a point system, and there was a certain amount of points. And this was at the beginning of summer. So I had 4 babies at home in the middle of summer, and I had no car. And if I drove and I got caught, my license would be taken away forever. Like, it was like a really big deal. So for 3 months, I hired college babysitters, and like, you know, I was kind of at their mercy. If they had time to come up and they couldn't come, I'm like, well, I'm not going to get any of my stuff done. I mean, I literally was like stuck at home, and Reese had to go to work, and I felt like I just had to give up control and say, you know what, we may just have peanut butter and jelly for dinner. I didn't get to the store. Or I maybe got 2 things on my list done, and you know what, that she had to leave. She was on a schedule, and I just had to let go, and I feel like God just relaxed me and helped me not to just operate out of this wound, because really it's not trusting God. That's what over-control is. You're really just afraid. You're playing God. You have to take matters in your own hands, and God's going, just trust me. Take the pressure off. I'm not putting that on you. You're putting that on yourself. And sometimes we do things God didn't even ask us to do out of the controlling spirit. And I think this is where Martha found herself. But Mary chose what was better. So what did Mary choose? She chose to be in the moment. She chose to play with her kids and not worry about the to-do list. That's how it would relate to us. She chose to let the dishes go and enjoy Jesus. She chose to just let go and control a little bit. To have peace in her heart, be enlightened by the Lord. She chose to see the big picture and not just try to control everyone and have everything so perfect. She just let it go a little bit. She chose what was better. She wasn't operating out of stress. She was operating out of the right heart. So I think as women, when we start over-controlling and hyper-controlling and trying to control, we kind of need to look at our heart and go, okay, am I planning months in advance? Am I overdoing my calendar? I just need to be at peace and enjoy this moment. Enjoy what God's given me today and let go of control. So the second point, if you're taking notes, Jesus freed her from her need to control by showing her a better way. By showing her a better way. So the last point is confusion. Jesus lightened her in her confusion. And Martha was a planner, and she was logical, and she was type A, and she wanted the facts, and A plus B equals C, and she had a plan. And Jesus the plan didn't go as she thought. And she was confused, and she was devastated. And how many times have we been there as women? So God's teaching her a lesson here and enlightening her on what faith looks like. So in this next story, it's too long for me to read it. It's in John chapter 11, 1 through 44. But I'm going to give you the highlights and summarize it. So what's happening here is their little brother Lazarus got deathly ill. And Jesus was about a day's journey away teaching. So they sent word to Jesus, and they said, Lord, the one you love is sick. They knew Jesus loved them. The one you love is sick, and Jesus sent word back saying, this sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that his son may be glorified. So Martha's like, okay, it won't end in death. Well, Jesus waited 4 more days before he came back, and in that 4-day period, Lazarus died. He died, and so Martha didn't know what to do with this. I mean, they buried him. They buried him in a tomb. So when Jesus did come into town 4 days later, Martha goes to meet him on the outskirts of town, and it says, in John 11:20, when Martha heard Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him. She's proactive. She's going looking for answers. But Mary stayed home. So we can just see the difference in their personalities. And she says to him, Lord, if you had been there, my brother wouldn't have died. If you'd have been there. She's saying, where were you? Where were you? I'm confused. I thought this was the plan, and you were supposed to come, and you didn't come, and now my brother died. And so many times when we're confused, we can doubt God's presence, and we can doubt God's power. So this is where were you? You had the power to heal. Why weren't you there? And this is where she found herself. She was doubting his presence. She was doubting his power. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. And she says, I know Lord will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. And basically what she's saying is, I know I'll see him again in heaven. I mean, I know I'll see him when his body's resurrected in heaven. But Jesus revealed to her new truth in her confusion. He says, resurrection isn't a future event. I'm the resurrection. I'm the life. Whoever believes in me will live, even though he dies. And then he asks the question, do you believe this? Do you believe this? And what he's telling her is, I'm the resurrection. In other words, I have resurrection power. And what he's telling her is, I am the life. The life of my presence is with you. You're doubting my presence. You're doubting my power. I have resurrection power, and I am with you. He's telling her these truths. And I don't know if she fully grasped it, because he says, do you believe this? And she says, yes, Lord, I believe you're the Christ, the Son who's come into the world. She knows he's God in the flesh. She knows he's divine, but he's taking her further. So he says, let's go to the tomb. And he says, okay, roll away the stone. And then I love Martha, because you just see her personality. She's like, wait. If we roll away the stone, Lord, she's interrupting the miracle. If we roll away the stone, Lord, I mean, he's been in there 4 days, it's going to smell. So she's thinking facts. She's thinking logic. She doesn't quite understand faith. And Jesus again tells her, Martha, did I not tell you that if you believed, then you would see the glory of God? He defines faith. First, you got to believe. Then you'll see. But see, she wanted to see, and then she would believe. Well, he's dead. He's in there, and he's showing her his power. He's showing her his resurrection power, and he's showing her his life. But he's proving this point to her. He's going to demonstrate it. But she's stuck in logic, and faith defies logic. Faith is supernatural. It isn't logical, and we as planners can kind of go, well, I need to see it, and then I'll believe it. And God's going, I'm not letting you do it that way. That's not how faith works. That's not how my kingdom works. You believe in my power. You believe in my presence. Then you'll see my glory. That's how faith works. In 2 Corinthians 5:7, it says, walk by faith, not by sight. We can't plan it. We would take credit for it. Faith is supernatural. We can look back and say, only God could have done that. Only God could have done that. So he says, Lazarus, come out. And the dead man came out. And he rose from life. He gave her a physical demonstration of what resurrection power looks like. He did that for us on the cross. He did that for us. The stone was rolled away, and Jesus defeated death. He says, no, I have resurrection power. I bring the presence of my life with you. You believe it, and then you'll see my glory. But you got to believe I am who I say I am. So how does this translate for us? Martha thought Lazarus was dead. How many of us think maybe our marriage is dead? And God says, no, if you believe in my power, then you'll see my glory. I raise dead things to life. I have resurrection power. You think that relationship's dead, that friendship's dead, that teenager's too far gone. You know, I'm depressed. I don't have any joy. No, I resurrect joy. I have resurrection power. I resurrect faith. I bring dead things to life, but you got to believe it, and then you'll see it. It's in that order. So when you're confused, when the plan's not going your way, and you think something's dead, the same Spirit that raised Christ from the dead lives in us. When we say yes to Jesus, when we believe he is who he says he is, that same Spirit has resurrection power is in us. He can resurrect it, but we got to believe it. We got to believe in his power and his presence, and then we see his glory. And then we see it. So the final thought, when you're confused, don't doubt, believe. Believe. That's what faith is. So the final thought, if you're taking notes, Jesus enlightened Martha in her confusion by showing her his resurrection power, telling her to believe in his resurrection power. That's what we do when we're confused. We just keep believing. So in closing, Jesus enlightens us just as he does Martha as we walk with him in relationship. He's continually freeing up our minds. He's after our freedom. He wants to enlighten us, but we got to be disciples. We got to spend time in his presence so that we understand his views on culture. We understand if we're being too controlling. He can enlighten us. He can gently correct us. He can show us. And in our confusion, we believe in his power, and then we see his glory. We can look back and see his hand in our lives. As we sit at his feet, as his disciples, Jesus enlightens us, and he gives us his perspective. Thank you. That's all for today.